Welcome to Connie Martinson Talks Books. We're at the Four Seasons Hotel in Beverly Hills, and we're talking with Maureen Reagan, who has just been the speaker for the diabetes unit of Cedars-Sinai Hospital's fundraiser luncheon. And she is the author of First Father, First Daughter, a memoir published by Little Brown. And we will be back after a short pause with Maureen Reagan.
Black writers often use their personal sagas to help readers identify with the black experience. Best at this is Maya Angelou. She has written 5 autobiographies and 6 books of poetry that deal with the issues of being black, female, and American.
And I got another hero, me. And me is not just a proud member of the graduating class of the Lafayette County Training School. Me is a proud member of the Negro race, the wonderful, beautiful Negro race.
I don't write about myself to glorify myself, but rather I write through the black experience, because that's what I know, to examine more clearly the human condition. The goal was not only to encourage reforms, but to pay tribute to the many blacks who, even in the midst of adversity, endured.
Maya Angelou, a voice for the people.
Each year, 15 million family pets and wild creatures innocently fall prey to steel traps. The cries of the injured and dying animals have been heard by Laurence Olivier and painfully inspired his famous scream of Oedipus.
I often go to animals for these images. I was a fox caught in a trap by the feet. Because that, to me, has a dreadful connotation somehow. The utter helplessness and the torment of some wild beast caught in a trap. I used to feed on that a great deal to get that scream, to try to get into it all the agony of every animal in the world who'd ever been caught in a trap, and that agonizing pain.
Help stop the pain. Abolish steel traps.
Welcome back. We're at the Four Seasons Hotel in Beverly Hills, and I am speaking with Maureen Reagan, author of First Father, First Daughter, published by Little Brown. Welcome, Maureen.
Nice to be here.
And I feel like I have followed your career from the era when we were all at first involved with the women's issues many years ago, to what you have been doing and accomplishing on your own, as well as what a wonderful book about how little Maureen was the daughter of Jane and Ronnie, the star, and yet going to Washington with Nancy and Ronnie. Wonderful book that you've covered so much history, Maureen.
Thank you.
As a result, there are those who are going to ask, what happened during those, well, when you were not allowed to be on the campaign trail? Because I found that interesting that you who were so vocal and really a strong character could be shunted aside during the first campaigns.
Well, we're talking about the mid-'60s. And as I talk about the book, I was a political neophyte, and the political system should be spared neophytes. We come with great enthusiasm, but not a tremendous amount of knowledge. But it was at a period in time in the middle '60s in which the Republican Party was in the throes of upheaval. We were changing standard bearers, our philosophy was realigning, there were a lot of things happening in the Goldwater era. And the people who ultimately ran Governor Reagan's first campaign in 1966 were part of the old guard, and I was part of the new guard. So they used the fact that they didn't want me around by insisting that because there was the potential of a divorce issue, it would be better if I wasn't involved, you see. But they had an ulterior motive.
And you do come back, though, into that second campaign where you say, wait a minute, Dad, do you realize how many women are out there? And that's the point where I remember you being out there working for ERA with Judy Carter, and there was a bridge of women saying, we want to be heard.
Well, the thing that happened in the early 80s was that suddenly the bipartisanship of the women's movement that Judy and I had worked so hard to bring about in the 1970s, among other people, there were many others besides us, but I think we were the most visible team of bipartisanship of the women's movement suddenly began to be used only by one side of the aisle and against Republican women running for office, Margaret Heckler and Millicent Fenwick being two perfect examples. And so given the opportunity to come back to Washington to design the plan for dealing with the gender gap for the Republican Party and to work with the president, I determined that there was either going to be a bipartisan women's movement or there were going to be two political women's movements. But we were just as feminist as our opposition, and everybody should know that.
Maureen, I should say this was the first book that was published by one of the Reagans about the White House years. So that you truly were the first to say, wait a minute, Don Regan doesn't really like women too much. And I think he accuses you, as you quote in the book, about you're running the West.
Well, Donald Regan and I had quite a few run-ins. The most vocal at which he used his well-known use of profanity was a time when I was very concerned about the fact that they were papering a meeting. In other words, bringing in extra bodies to a meeting because they had called us at the Republican National Committee and asked for bodies when there was something else that I thought would be better to do. And so I called him, and I had no desire to make it public. I had no desire to talk to people outside. I went to him, and he became hysterical and started screaming at me that I was trying to run the West Wing, which was patently absurd. I mean, there was no way. But there is no one who has more of a president's best interest than members of the family. And if they also happen to be paid politicos, which I was at that time, then it stands to reason that you ought to listen to them.
Maureen, I read the book, and as I read it, I kept saying, when a father has a son, they go out and they play baseball, they go out and they play football. As the firstborn with Ronald Reagan, your game was politics. That's the glue of the relationship in many ways.
We went out and played the family game,
Yeah. And you're the one who says, what are you doing being a Democrat? You're supposed to be a Republican.
Well, it was a great shock to me in 1960 when I first came to politics to realize that the politics that I liked, which was the rough and tumble of candidates getting elected and how you did that, and the community action that he had always been involved with was one and the same. And all those years of the dinner conversations of philosophy and problem solving, and I suddenly found out he was on the other side of the fence. I just could not believe this. This horrified me.
Some names. Michael Deaver.
I think in the book I say that he gives chutzpah a bad name.
Yes. And though you're the same age, he treated you like...
about a 12-year-old. Yes, he always did.
A wonderful man, Jess Unruh, a character, really.
Jess was my buddy. I first met Jess in 1967, just after the president had become governor. And, of course, Jess was the leader of the state assembly at the time. And I met him because I was trying to get a job in the PR department at a well-known airline of the day, Pacific Southwest Airlines. And they thought I was too partisan, which I thought was kind of funny. And so a friend of mine used a favor that he had with Jess and introduced me to him. And the next thing I knew, they were told that I wasn't too partisan, and if I was good for the job, I should get it.
An outstanding woman, Jean Kirkpatrick, who you go to for advice when you're on your way to Nairobi.
And she just laughs and says, "Welcome to the United Nations."
Yeah. How much exposure did you have with her?
Well, one of my absolutely favorite times in this life goes back to a time just before Jean left the ambassadorship at the UN. And she was giving a luncheon for a very dear friend of ours, Nancy Clark Reynolds, and she had invited Nancy and myself and Lois Harrington, who was then an assistant attorney general, to come and spend the night. And so the next morning, we were all in our jammies at the breakfast table, having coffee and rolls, and laughing and talking about life in general, and having a great old gab fest. And she and Jean and Lois were talking about how they'd never learned to type, and they'd never learned to sew, and all this, and they have all the terrible problems in life. And I just sat there and fascinated. And finally I said, you know, ladies, if we were to go down in the lobby of this hotel and to ask somebody of the three of us who we are and who the feminist was, I'd be willing to bet that 99% of them would say me. Did you know that I started in life as a secretary who made her own clothes? Which proved that the old school, the skills of typing and sewing didn't detract from our ability to change things.
That's the period, too, Maureen, in the book, that is very open and vulnerable, and that is, you don't give his name, but you talk about the period, and I understand it was only in reading this book that your parents understood what had been happening about being abused in your first marriage.
Well, I was 3,000 miles from home, and it was a period in which I didn't see family very much. We, in the early 60s, we didn't travel like we do today. Nobody did. It was, you were away from home. And so it was all over before I finally came back to California, and I never saw any reason to really get into an in-depth discussion with them. But I also felt that because it is an issue that I care very much about, and also because there were times, political times, in fact, in preparation for Nairobi, when I had to sort of duke it out with the Attorney General, Edwin Meese, and others about funding for some shelters for battered women. People were never really understood why I was willing to almost commit political suicide over an issue like that, so I thought it was time they knew.
Then we should say it's wonderful you are in such a happy marriage today.
Absolutely.
And in the book, the wonderful pictures, because there's a great Nolan Miller dress our Dynasty lady is wearing, and I don't blame you for wearing it in all those pictures.
Isn't that hysterical?
Yeah.
It turned out when we put the pictures together that I always wore that dress. Nolan told me at that point I must retire that dress.
Yeah. Maureen, the other part, too, is you talk about how in the White House and through, all of the horrendous experiences with the hospital, with the attempted attack on your father, your closeness with Nancy, that you suddenly became more than just stepmother, stepdaughter.
Well, I think one of the nicest things that we can ever do with parents is, as we become adults, is to become friends with them. I think that's the most important thing. I don't need parents today as much as I need friends, and I think that's true of them too. I think you get to a point in life at which you stop blaming everybody for anything that ever happened, and you go on. And at that moment, you don't have to worry about the past.
A couple of questions briefly. You ran for the Senate in California. Not a happy time. Are you ever going to run again?
Well, it wasn't an unhappy time. It just wasn't a successful time. But since there were 13 candidates in the race, there were a lot more losers than winners.
And you came in 5 then out of 13, which wasn't too bad.
Not too bad, not too bad.
Have your mother, your father and Nancy come for dinner yet?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. They were there several months ago, yes.
Because you say in the book, when they're president, to have the Secret Service come and all of that.
Oh, it's worse than just the Secret Service. For the president to come, they have to bring in all the communications gear and all this kind of stuff. And he said they literally rip a wall out of your house and they close all the traffic off on the street. He said, please don't invite me. You'll never be able to live in that neighborhood again.
Maureen, I can only say the 1980s certainly have been the Ronald Reagan decade. And as we are all women living longer and older, and there is, like a good wine, the maturation. Maybe the 1990s and the year 2000 will be the Maureen Reagan decade. I do hope you're going to run again at a future time, and you certainly have held up the banner for women of both parties to sort of follow. Will you autograph my book?
It would be my pleasure.
And we'll be back after a short pause.